Welcome to this new session on South versus North. Can the G7 be a real bridge? Let me briefly introduce our guest. Finally, I meet also the last guest. So, Daniel Gros on my left, Director of the Institute for European Policymaking at the Bocconi University. Abla Abdellatif, Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, ECHES, in Egypt. Evangelos Kalpadakis, who is the last one, actually, a diplomatic advisor to the leader of the main opposition, Syriza, and Alec Russell, foreign editor of Financial Times. So let's get started. South versus North and the G7, because as you know, in 2 months or so, the G7 leaders will meet in Apulia, in the southern part of Italy. They will eat pasticciotti, which is the typical cookie of Apulia, very, very good, delicious dessert, and they will have to find an agreement on the final communiqué of the G7. So the basic question for all of us is, are they going to find an agreement, and on what? And if the G7 and this meeting in Apulia can be a bridge towards the global south. But let's be frank before we start, twice frank. First thing, don't even think of G7 leaders meeting in Apulia and say, is it the G7 really going to be a bridge with the south? They have another question for themselves. How can we build bridges among the G7 partners? Because there are many, many issues on which, there are divides among G7 leaders when it comes to economy, subsidies between, and all the huge disputes between Europe and the United States. Also, when it comes to conflicts, and let's be very clear on that. I mean, despite this show of unity of the G7 leaders, we have different views. And if things keeps escalating in the near future, maybe this division could become even clearer. You probably read over the last few hours that there is this news that Iran could attack Israel in a matter of hours. And we know that among the G7 countries, there are different views on this. So first, okay, this question that we have, how can they build bridges with the global south? Well, it's a bit misleading because, the G7 still has to build bridges inside the G7 state. And second, very briefly, well, don't be, let's be again very frank. I mean, the G7 is perceived by the global south as the club of the rich. So we are not very convincing, when we say that we can be a bridge towards the global south. So I would start from this with Alec Russell. Alec, so is the G7 building more bridges or more walls vis-a-vis the global south?
Well, I don't know if there are any architects in the audience here, but I can give you a very glib and quick answer to your question, which is that it's a very bad time for bridge builders in the global north, and it's quite a good time for builders of walls, literally walls in the case of parts of the European Union, where walls are being built on frontiers to try and keep out migrants. But obviously also metaphorically in terms of protectionism. But more seriously, it's a really good time to ask this question, because I know that there's been a lot of talk about the decline of the West. That has been a running theme through this forum and beyond. But actually, despite what you said about the divisions in the G7, I think you can really argue that the G7 is more united now than it's possibly ever been. So if you go back 20, 30 years, there were endless disputes within the G7, as you said, about economic models, about regulation between France and America, and so on. 15 years ago, we remember 2009, everyone thought the G7 was over, thought it was just on its way out, and it was all going to be about the G20. But it's now that the G20 is the forum that is really quite divided, and the G7 is pretty united partly, of course, in fact, primarily, of course, because it's shifted from economics and it's focusing, the G7 is now really about geopolitics and strategy. So how can this united G7 build more bridges? Very good question. I totally accept that relations between the G7 and, we'll use this term, we're going to come back to it later, the global south or however you want to call large parts of the rest of the world, are not great. The G7 is open to charges of hypocrisy and lack of trust. But I think there are two areas to conclude that bridges can and should be built that I'd like to focus on. One of them is, as was referenced in the previous panel, Africa in particular, I'd say the Sahel. I think there's a golden opportunity for the G7 to spend more time and money focused on the Sahel, which has been appallingly neglected by the entire international community, apart from Russia, of course. And the other is climate finance, which again, this is an incredibly fraught issue. The richer countries are seen by many of the poorer countries as having failed to deliver on that. But I think that is an area where bridges can, should, and will be built.
Two of the possible topics, because I think that there is a role for the G7 to find a sort of least common denominator on many topics. You mentioned, of course, a couple of them, but when it comes, for instance, to regulation on digital markets, on the AEI, I mean, there is room for the G7 to build, a consensus among those countries, and then, of course, having another, the G20 or other international organizations and institutions in which, of course, this could be delivered. But let me now switch to Abla. Abla, among the five of us, you are not only the only lady, but you are the only one from the Global South. So my question for you is the same question that I did 1 month ago to 1,000 future leaders coming from over 60 countries in Milan at the Bocconi University and at ISPI, and we asked them, okay, do you think that the rise of the Global South can contribute to international stability and peace, or is adding, to the instability because of the inevitable crash between the Global South and the Global North? And the vast majority of them responded, we think that the rise of Global South will contribute to stability. So they are much more, probably more optimistic than we are. But of course, let me ask this to you and then also to our Greek friend. Please.
Yes, thank you, Antonio. And it's great to be here. And I'm very glad to be part of this, this important forum. And your question is very interesting, and I agree with the young people that you had in Italy. This is the quickest.
Because you are young as well.
No, actually, but let me take your question, which is actually a challenging question, and raise a couple of questions of my own from it. When you say, is the rising South going to add to the problems or to the solutions? My question is, problems to who exactly? Okay, 80% of the people in the world are actually living in the South. And they are suffering from the unfairness distribution of the wealth, the problems with the climate. When you look at a continent like Africa, which is contributing no more than 3% of the problem, it's actually facing all sorts of repercussions in terms of desertification and floods and all sorts of problems. All right, so they are suffering from these issues, and definitely they want solutions to that. So the problem is not their problem. The problem is the problem of the North, of the G7, of the big countries that want things to happen and to remain as they used to be, or to go back to what they used to be, exactly as was mentioned in the previous session. Okay? They are not building bridges. If they are building bridges among themselves, is to protect themselves from the South, actually. This is what's happening. The pace of economic growth in the South is much faster than in the North, and what the North is trying to do right now is protect themselves to make sure that they are not surpassed by the South. And they are building walls against everybody else, and they wish, of course, that the earth would open, swallow Russia and China, and maybe Palestine as well, and then live happily ever after, a Cinderella story, and it's not going to happen. So this is my first question. My second question relates to when you say bringing peace and stability in the world. What kind of stability are we talking about? Are we talking about healthy stability? okay, and sustainable peace, or are we just talking about peace? And let me give you the example of the war that's happening in Gaza right now. Okay, if the war stops, there could be peace again, but it's definitely not sustainable. There was never sustainable peace in the Middle East because the core of the problem is not solved, and it's related to the land and the rights of the Palestinians to the land. And the position of the northern countries in the unconditional support to Israel does not contribute to that. So it's a matter of acceptance of the North.
How could the South facilitate a solution?
But when you talk, Palestine and the Middle Eastern countries are part of the South. So by raising their voice, by asking for the rights in this region, okay, they are contributing to the sustainability, to the healthy stability, and to the sustainable peace. So it's a matter of accepting the South. The North needs to accept the South, all of it, the global South, including accepting the existence of China and India and all the rising powers.
Evangelos, let me turn to you. Do you agree on what she said? I mean, we are building bridges inside the G7 just to protect ourselves.
Well, for sure, this is an impression that we hear from the South more and more, and that I think that in itself should be something of great concern for us. But I think, just to take a step back to respond to your question, I think the first thing we have to accept in terms of the West or the North is that we have to build multilateralism and multilateral institutions to ensure peace and stability on the basis of an increasingly multipolar world. Multilateralism, when the first concept of the South was coined in the 70s and 80s, was based on multilateralism in a bipolar world. Then we talked about multilateralism in a unipolar world, basically, in the 90s and 2010s, after the Cold War. Now we have to build multilateralism and multilateral institutions in a world that we have to accept will be an increasingly multipolar world. And that means rethinking a lot of the institutions. It means, first of all, starting with the basic understanding that a lot of countries that are not in the West and do not connect themselves to the West will have different foreign policy directions, whether they are those of multi-alignment, whether they are those that are more opportunistic or less opportunistic. What we need to focus on is to avoid what Alec has referred to, I think in one of his articles, an a la carte world, and a world where opportunism is the basic logic. And the only way to do that is to build multilateral institutions. And a lot of those, in order to build them, we have to be thinking of what are the tools to use. For me, I think that, first of all, the first start is to not group all countries together in the logic of a global South. We have the least developing countries that have very different priorities and interests. We have countries that are basically we have already seeing like China in the top countries of the world in terms of technology, economy. We'll see India be third in mostly everything in the next 10 years. And then we have other middle powers that will be vying according to their interests in one direction or the other. So Western diplomacy and EU diplomacy that is understanding of this should start by having a more fine-tuned logic and being more issues-based. So we referred to the question of climate change and how to find more climate finance. How are we going to work towards the COP30 in Brazil, where we can find common ground with the Global South on issues, but in terms that perhaps do not come from the West anymore, the way the first COP summits came from? How are we going to mobilize Europeans in the direction of resolving some of these issues, while at the same time building bridges, as we say, but in a more focused basis? Sahel was mentioned before. I think a smarter and more focused way, a helpful, more focused way to look at it is through the question of migration. We had a very important migration compact coming out from Morocco in 2018, and the European Union basically did nothing to promote it on one of the issues that's the most important for European Union citizens. If we can work in this direction, we can mobilize Western European citizens to strengthen these bridges for the interests of European citizens, but recognizing what exactly it is in Africa, in Asia, in the Global South that they need in order for us to be able to solve problems together. And that way we can build a new multilateral architecture on the basis of a multipolar world with the stakes and the space for opportunism and a la carte movement being smaller and smaller. A last point. How have we shown that we are not sensitive enough to these questions and we don't understand the messages we are getting from the rest of the world? The question of Ukraine. On the question of Ukraine, we clearly have an invasion of one country, of Russia, against Ukraine. Instead of framing it with our biggest and strongest tool, which is the question of multilateralism that we referred to, and speaking to the rest of the world about it on this basis, we made it about democracy and non-democracy. A completely incorrect message in order to get support for the war in Ukraine, for our position on the war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Angelo. So you were mentioning this need, of course, to rethink multilateral institutions because they are not working. And, you know, power distribution in this multilateral institution, frankly speaking, is just, you know, a black and white picture of the 50s. So it's now for you, Daniel. They are right. I mean, the Global South is right when they complain about these multilateral institutions. Take the IMF, for instance. We have seen a number of reforms of the IMF still. European countries, let's admit it, they have overrepresented. The United States still have a veto power in the IMF. So they complain, and maybe, probably rightly so.
That is quite true. I mean, the Europeans want to have the cake and eat it. They want to keep the IMF and the other institutions as they knew them in the past. But in the meantime, the world has changed. And naturally, the role of the Europeans and the US in particular should be reduced. But it's very difficult to see anybody in international relations to say, yes, I see the world has changed. I voluntarily give up the prerogatives I have, right? That is, I was going to say, not human. It's not in the nature of nation states. The one perhaps part where I disagree with your implicit in your question is that it is actually not, if you want, the global south which wants to have more say or higher share in the IMF. It's basically China, right? And China and some fast-growing Asian countries.
And India.
To some extent, India. But the real, if we really use the IMF formula, the so-called global south would not gain much. But China's weight, of course, would explode. And here we're coming to the big unifier of the G7, which is China. Today, the G7 is basically about China on the economic side. And of course, Russia in the short run on the geopolitical side. But again, with China always lurking in the background. And I think China is the difference between G7 and G20. China is the difference between a representative IMF and World Bank and a G7-dominated one. So I must say, this global south in this particular fight of the giants gets a little bit a sideshow only. But I think China is really the one thing which drives the G7 these days.
Thank you. Alec, let me quote you. Because, you know, there is a matter of definition. This is also what Evangelo said. I mean, we talk about Global South, but what is it? Because there are different parts of the Global South. There are too many ingredients in the recipe. And you said, for instance, again, I quote you, this label is a vague, geographically inept, and yet emotionally resonant term for what once was known as the developing world. So it's the same thing, really?
Well, there is something, some in the audience may agree with this, I don't know. There is something about the term Global South that drives some people nuts. And I know this because whenever I've written about it, I get a deluge of emails and comments under the line, and it's all the usual stuff. Global South, but China and India, they're in the north. We get it. Global South, people say, but there's a sort of rag bag of different sized economies and feuding entities and so on. Absolutely, that is true. But there still is something I would contend to it. And forgive me for speaking your point effectively, but for decades, of course, there was a non-aligned movement. And the term Global South has resonance and emotion that far transcend its sort of geographical inexactitude and so on. I think what's really interesting now is that, yes, the last few years, the world has finally woken up to the fact that what used to be known as the developing world is suddenly much more powerful economically, wants to be more powerful politically. On that point, I remember talking to some of my colleagues soon after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and some of them were writing or thinking of writing quite glibly, you know, the world's united in outrage. I said, absolutely, the world is not united in outrage about that. There are large parts of the world that are not. I think what's interesting now is whether it's possible that, as it were, the Global South movement, for want of another way of putting it, has possibly reached a plateau for now. I think there is an inexorability depending on what happens in China, both politically and economically, because that's obviously Daniel was saying, that is the critical element here. But I think for now, I think we're at something of a Global South plateau. It's a much more important plateau than it was on a few years ago.
So Global South is on the right, but now let's be very pragmatic. Let's consider, what are global issues, global challenges, and let's see in 3 to 5 years from now, in concrete terms, I mean, blending necessity with realism. What can the Global South achieve in terms of fight against climate change, in terms of peaceful resolution of conflicts, in concrete terms? Because everybody's talking about the rise of Global South, and we all agree, we all know it's happening, we know that they have fair requests, but in concrete terms, and it is a question for everybody. I will start with Abla, then of course Evangelos, just also the other. Please, Abla.
Okay, but I have to start by thanking Alec for talking positively about the Global South. It must be the influence of being in Egypt and drinking from the Nile, I'm sure. Okay. I'm saying I want to thank Alec first, okay? And then before answering your question, I need to start by saying that even this definition of the fact that the Global South might be divided into different types, and the G7 should focus on issues and not focus on this idea of trying to make it look weaker or messier, okay, does not deny the fact that it is there. And you have a big mess with the G7, actually. The developed countries are not exactly in terrible harmony. They have their issues, and this could be a topic for a session in its own right. What are the things that can change? Okay? I think that the platform for change is going to be the G20, which is actually becoming very active. Already the agenda of the G20 has been expanding beyond the financial issues when it was first created, and it was thanks to the voice of countries from the South. You have India, the G20 in India made a big difference, putting the Global South at the center of the global governance. They actually also introduced the African Union, expanding the voice. Doesn't mean that the African Union does not have zillions of reforms to do inside, but it is there, and it's a louder.
Let me be a bit more provocative. Okay, yeah. The reform of the UN. There was a session just before us. They were talking about this convention on the reform of the UN, the fight against climate change. With all these issues, what is the contribution, the concrete contribution that we can expect from the Global South in 3 to 5 years from now?
Reform of the UN, specifically the UN Security Council, this horrible use of the veto power. It's a matter of pressure. It's a matter of louder voice, okay, by ones who are suffering because of this. That will make the difference. So hopefully this is going to be a change. I expect a change in the climate finance in the climate justice, mainly because the G20 is in Brazil now. Okay, next year is going to be in South Africa. Then you're going to have the COP. But the big problem here is that all those changes, all this pressure is going to be very, very slow. And you can see it. I mean, when you look at something, again, very specific, climate-related, the Loss and Damage Fund, okay? 10 years of research, then it started in COP27, nothing, okay, just an empty box. Then in COP28, it started to have a bit of shape. Now they have a board for this fund that has 12 members from the developed countries and 14 from the developing world. How do you expect their decisions to be made if money is going to be put from the developed countries? It's a matter of a stronger voice to push for the change, because what the issue with all attempts to change the financial infrastructure right now is you are asking the same institutions, the same countries that are benefiting from their power to let go of that power and give more rights to the South, which is not going to happen. Okay? The only way to do it is to have a bigger change.
Evangelos, if you agree, I mean, in 3 to 5 years from now, what do you see that the Global South will be really able to do?
I think it's hard to tell. Definitely the momentum is growing in this direction. I'm not sure if the reference to a plateau is right. Definitely now the broadening of the BRICS and the enlargement of the BRICS gave a very clear signal. There is talk of a new development. I mean, the idea of the new development bank is there from the BRICS. I think post-COVID, China will be looking again at how to work with the Belt and Road Initiative, open cooperation in this way. For sure, Israel in the next, India in the next 5 to 7 years will be again asserting itself in different levels, including this question of reform. And the G20 there will be very important, as will be the question of UN Security Council reform. But whether or not there will be progress in 3 to 5 years, I think it's difficult to tell that it could happen in such a small span of time. I think definitely we all need to take a step back, and I think you're absolutely correct that the West, as a geopolitical entity, has a lot of rethinking to do in terms of what exactly we want to see in the next 3, 5, 10 years. Because the pressure will be there, and it's absolutely justified pressure for reform of multilateral institutions. And it's not clear what the positions will be from our part in this regard. Will it be enough to just push back? And the criticism in this direction will be very tough. A lot of the elections we'll see will define a lot of this. But definitely we need to be rethinking in the West, and this is why the contributions of the former prime ministers, Papandreou and Le Pen, in this direction about how this discussion should open are very, very important, because we need to be rethinking this in general. We have failed in important areas that are in our direct neighborhood. Dealing with Ukraine and is something that we'll have to be looking at in the next 3 to 5 years, and that will define what our position will be in 5 years in terms of global developments. You mentioned Gaza, and that's absolutely clear. If we can't develop a different kind of architecture the way we were trying to develop some of our countries, also Greece being one of them, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and if our Western, quote unquote, security architecture in the OSCE has fallen apart practically completely in the last years, how can we be talking about a new architecture on a global level years from now? Unfortunately, we only have questions in this regard and more pressure that will be mounting. I hope we have some more answers in the General Assembly and other initiatives to come.
There is no doubt that after the discussion, I mean, there is the Global South, but there is a country which is, completely different from all the others. There is China. And in this game between the Global North and the Global South, there is a risk of decoupling, or more wisely, the risking, as we now like to say, in the United States and in Europe. But maybe the risk, the coupling that we are seeing is between economy and geopolitical issues, because in an international context with so many confrontations and rivalries, we should see economy going very badly, which is not entirely the case. Trade, in terms of trade, of FDI, yes, of course, global value chains are changing, also FDI's flows are changing, but the economy is doing relatively well. So why is it so, or is it just a matter of time, and sooner or later this, apparent decoupling will be over, and also economy will be much more confrontational, will go down?
Now you have to distinguish between the economy, as you said, appearing to go well, in particular trade flows holding up, and actually people living better, right? And in particular, this China-US trade barriers bring about a complete separation. For years after the Second World War, when we abolished trade barriers, we abolished them against everybody, and that means that both trade and welfare increased. Now it's between the US and China that trade barriers are being erected. And in that particular case, economics predict that you could actually have a situation where trade increases, but welfare goes down. People live less well. I give you an example of how trade can increase, and you all know that. The US closes its border effectively to Chinese, let's say, electronic equipment. And then the Chinese export the bits and pieces to Malaysia, and Malaysia exports the assembled products. Maybe to Egypt, maybe to Mexico, right? So you have double the trade flows. First to Malaysia, yes, and then to the US, right? The value chain, as it gets longer, more costs, right? More ships running around. But of course, the US and China both live less well. But that part of the global south, which has some manufacturing ability, gains. It gains because it can attract these plants. Of course, to benefit, it has to have two things. It has to have, let's see, a decent infrastructure. It has to have, let's say, a basic manufacturing sector, and it has to have low tariffs. And that's why India is out of the game. They could become the new platform, what China was before, but since they have crazy tariffs, they don't get it. Malaysia and other countries have very low tariffs. They say, come in and go out, and we at least get some jobs going. So I think that's one way how the global south can actually benefit. Not all of them, but those that have at least the basis to be able to grasp this opportunity, which I think is an opportunity in a lifetime. Because otherwise, China has a near monopoly on all this manufacturing stuff.
And not only that, because we still have 3 minutes, so it's a question very briefly for all of you. I mean, we all know that China is different from all the other countries from the global south. They are investing a lot. They are investing in our infrastructures in Europe, but also in Egypt, also some other countries from the south. They are investing, for instance, the Emirates in Egypt a lot. And, especially in Europe, we have this feeling that, China is pursuing this policy of divide and rule. Okay, they are buying Piraeus. They bought part of the Piraeus here. They are doing, they are buying other infrastructures around Europe. So is it a real threat? And this is really the point on which there could be a real fight between the West and especially this country, which have the funds, the money, okay, to buy our strategic assets. So very briefly, the three of you, it's only 1 minute each.
Well, if I can give an example from Greece and in terms of the Piraeus port, because clearly this is what you're referring to. I mean, Greece, a lot of countries that we said have a tradition of multi-alignment. Greece has a tradition of a multi-dimensional foreign policy. It's a member of EU and NATO, but it has the possibility to make its choices in terms of investments it gets while fulfilling its commitments. And this is very important. Let's not forget the role that the IMF has played in all these years, just like it played in Greece. Privatization is being pushed in different countries. And then when Chinese investments come up, we criticize why the Chinese have come and not other Western companies. Well, they come because they have a stronger industrial policy many times. To close with this, we have to decide to have strong screening processes, just like we've developed in terms of regulations from 2019 in the EU, so that we are not scared of foreign direct investment, but we can protect our critical infrastructure in Europe.
Alec?
Yes, very briefly. There is a very hostile climate in my country, Britain, at the moment towards Chinese investment. It's changed quite dramatically in the last 5 or 10 years. About 10 years ago, the government had a very sort of excited vision of Chinese investment. That has changed. I'd just like to say one more thing just in terms of the a la carte world. I'm actually a believer that the a la carte world could be, for quite a lot of countries, quite a good thing, because it allows them to play off China and America. And if you're, say, a country like Indonesia, this could be really good for you.
Habla, not only China.
I think that the fear from China is exaggerated, okay? And it's like the fear of innovation. It is a superpower that is emerging. It's doing a lot of investments in Africa, a lot more than in the case of Egypt, okay? And there is an economic benefit for its existence. The big fight between China and the US is I don't know, it's a created war. I know you don't like it, you don't like what I'm saying, the fighting of the giants, but there has to be an acceptance for this superpower that is there.
Thank you. The last word of Daniel.
Any offer the G7 can make to the Global South in terms of financing, the Chinese can outbid. The difference is that the Chinese not only outbid on the price, but they also say, you don't need to change your governance. And then the big question is, 10 years later, money without changes in governance, is it actually an advantage or a cost?
Okay, we have to close with this question mark. So thank you very much for joining this panel. Thank you all for the attention.